Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway. And no Gayatri this week. She's researching global warming in parts where it's warm. China is an economy like no other. It is the world's biggest, and its disastrous growth rate has slumped to 7%. That is 4 times our own. China's is a mixed economy like ours used to be, and then some. The state still plays the leading role in the economy, which has protected it from the worst of the excesses which have devastated Western economies, whilst China's has gone from strength to strength. But no man is an island, and no economy is either. Last month, the Chinese stock market suffered massive losses and sent a wave of panic cascading around the world. To make sense of it all, I've invited on board the Sputnik a man who was once central to the London mayoralty of Ken Livingstone and is now a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China in the People's Republic. He's our China expert, and he's John Ross. John, welcome to the Sputnik. Would you kindly sketch for the viewers the principal differences, structural differences between the Chinese economy and our own?
Well, the fundamental difference is that the Chinese economy, the state has the power to take the fundamental decisions. It doesn't administer the economy. There are many medium-sized, small-sized, even large-sized companies in China. But the crucial question is the largest companies in the country are owned by the state, and in particular the banks are owned by the state, the 4 biggest banks. Now, you have to understand they're colossal in scale. The annual savings going through the Chinese state-owned banks are twice, in absolute terms, the number of dollars by the whole private sector banking system in the United States. Therefore, the China doesn't try to run everything, doesn't try to run in Britain the equivalent of your fish and chip shop or your local Chinese restaurant or anything like that. But it has sufficient levers that if the economy goes down, it can increase investment and the economy will go back up again. If the economy is overheating, it can reduce the investment and the economy will cool down a bit. Therefore, it's like the state's a powerful rudder which can steer the economy without trying to run every single little bit of the economy.
And the great helmsman was once the Communist Party of China. Is it still? Is the Communist Party still running things in China?
The Communist Party takes all the fundamental decisions inside China. Also, it should be understood this is an extremely intelligent Communist Party. I know a little bit about China because they do that. In the old Soviet Union, to be truthful, the Communist Party didn't want to hear anything except what it already believed. In China, I know that they get my view. They also get people who have completely different views, even monetarist views, people I would disagree with. There's a mechanism, if there's a big decision coming up, not always, but you'll find a very wide range of experts inside China who are then asked their opinions on these subjects. Nobody outside of the Chinese Communist Party then knows what is done with all this information, but it is absolutely not the case that what they want to hear is only what they already believe. They have very, very big intelligence and big analysis.
And was I right in my introduction in saying that the reason China's economy is still growing at rates we would die to achieve because of the role of the state in the economy? Well, has the state protected the economy?
Yes, I mean, frankly, the talk about the Chinese economy in crisis is a joke. I mean, you have a situation whereby its economy is growing approximately 3 times as fast as the United States, and people write, and there's a big crisis in China. It is impossible to have an economy with 1.3 billion people in it that never encounters any problems. Of course, the situation in China, if you go back 10 years or 20 years ago in Beijing, everybody was riding bicycles. There were no problems of traffic jams. Now they have a very serious problem of traffic jams in Beijing because so many people have cars. So there are problems that arise all the time, but the crucial question is they don't bring the economy to a halt. And yes, the Chinese developed an economic system which had never been seen in the world before. Prior to that, there were only 2 economies. One was the capitalist economy, let's say, described by Adam Smith. And the second was the economy which was created by Stalin in 1929 in the Soviet Union, in which the state owned not only the large industry, but all small-scale local shops, every farm, etc. This was a mistake. There was no justification of having small companies, medium-sized companies owned by the state. It makes them inefficient. And on the other hand, the capitalist economy, because it doesn't control the largest economy, has huge falls in investment, as you saw in the Great Recession. The Great Recession is really the great investment collapse. And Osborne is keeping, for example, in the UK, the investment level down. China can overcome that. It has the most intelligent economic policy in the world, and it is because they don't try to run everything through the state, but they have powerful levers which the state can use, yes.
What happened then a couple of weeks ago when one woke up to massive falls in Shanghai, in stocks and shares in China, which then sent this wave of panic around the world, huge losses everywhere? What was the cause of that, and what are the implications of it?
Well, first you've got to understand the Chinese stock market. Two things. One is it's still up about 30% compared to it was at the beginning of this process. It's only fallen from already high level. But secondly, the Chinese stock market doesn't really play an important role in China's economy. We could argue about whether it does in any economy, but it certainly doesn't in China for two reasons. There's two ways that the stock market could affect the real economy. One would be through investment. But the reality is that very little investment money is raised on the Chinese stock exchange. You have some IPOs, people become rich, etc. But the great bulk of the investment is by the state-owned banks. Or it could affect the economy via, so therefore there's not going to be a big fall in investment. Or it could affect the economy via consumption, but less than 10% of China's economy population owns shares. So it has no great consumption effect on the economy either. So there's no big transmission effect into the real economy. I think the real, incidentally, shockwave wasn't the stock market. I think it was the small devaluation of the RMB. Because although China's financial system is very weakly connected to the world economy, its real economy is very big. And people got the idea that China was going to join the currency wars. I mean, the euro's been devalued by 20%. The yen's going to be devalued by 30%. If China decided to devalue by the RMB by 20%, that would have one tremendous impact through the world. But it never had any intention of doing so, doesn't need to. Its economy is competitive. It's carried out a small 3% devaluation, that's all.
It used to be said when America sneezed, everyone else in the world caught the cold. Have we now, were the events of a couple of weeks ago a sign that that position has now been taken by China?
There are two economies in the world now, what it means, yes. I mean, the effect was very big. As I say, I'm even being asked about this by foreign companies, etc. The real fear was China was going to carry out a big devaluation. That would send mayhem through the world. The realization got through to the United States that it used to be the case that the only person who could call the shots was the United States. Now they realize China can. If China, for example, decided we are really fed up with the way that the United States is acting, and therefore we're going to really devalue the RMB, this could have a shattering economic effect inside the United States.
Tell me, what would that effect be?
Well, because China's exports are already tremendously competitive. It's the world's largest trading nation, already has overtaken the United States in visible goods. Therefore, if it wanted to, if it thought, for example, its currency was being forced too high, and it was going to have to, therefore, not be able to be competitive and devalue the currency, it could trigger a gigantic export wave. It doesn't need to, because its industry is very competitive. That was why it was never going to have a big devaluation, but it could. Secondly, the financial firepower of China is now much bigger than the United States. There is only one financial superpower in the world, which is China. The United States economy, measured at market price, is still a bit bigger. You measure at parity purchasing powers, that's realistic exchange rates, is a bit smaller. But in finance, the power is in China. The total finance available for investment in China is now twice that of the United States, about $4.6 trillion compared to about $2.3 trillion. It's twice as big in absolute terms. That's why China is able to take things like the Asian Investment Bank that created and other things. China is now in financial terms in its bank stronger than the US.
This might become a bigger question if Jeremy Corbyn wins the Labour leadership and Labour looks like it might come to power in 2020. How could a socialist party in Britain put forward an economic plan that would make us look a bit more like China?
Well, the crucial question would be you would have to expand the state sector of the economy, not to nationalise everything, but you would have to have sufficient levers, say that you could double the rate of state investment. You would have to then create a state structure capable of carrying this out. You would have to have some state control out of the banks. There's nothing in principle that stops you moving towards a Chinese-type system.
It's a mixed economy, as I described at the beginning, as once we had. Perhaps the state element in China is greater than what we ever had, but not greater than what people like Jeremy Corbyn, Ken Livingstone, myself have consistently advocated in Labour politics over the decades.
Yes, I think that the position of the left on China has not really been very good. It hasn't understood how gigantic is the achievement. I mean, China has taken 630 million people out of poverty. To give you an idea, that is larger than the population of the entire European Union. Now, some people have the foolish idea this is capitalism, which is not. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. If capitalism is actually capable of taking 630 million people out of poverty, we would have to decide it's a rather good thing. But it's not. And the left hasn't paid enough attention to this. China's had the fastest growth rate in human history for 35 years.
It's 150% over that period, yeah?
Oh, even more, yeah. Even more, much more than that, right? And the left hasn't paid enough attention to this because China was an underdeveloped country. It's not now. Now, people in places like Latin America are beginning to pay a huge amount of attention to it because China's living standard has gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to the majority of the population of the world now has a lower living standard than China. And we shouldn't mechanically copy the Chinese model. We couldn't do so. But the fundamental principles which it has, which is the state should control and uptake the economy, incidentally, Keynes himself wrote this. Keynes said that regulating the level of investment cannot safely be left to the private sector. He called for what he called a somewhat comprehensive socialisation of investment, by which the somewhat meaning not wholly state-owned. You could see it from either a left-wing Keynesian point of view, or you could see it from a Chinese point of view. It's not really terribly important which you do. It's that the state must have sufficiently large instruments that if the economy turns down, it can raise the level of investment and speed the economy up. If the economy is overheating, it can cut the level of investment. That's the key principle. It's the failure of investment in Britain and the United States which has condemned us to the great stagnation. It's not terribly extreme. I mean, even people like Martin Wolf in the Financial Times says it's absolutely ridiculous. The government can borrow in real terms at close to 0%, but it refuses to invest. Yeah. This is ludicrous.
John Ross, fascinating talking to you in a week when all eyes have been on China with the victory parade and so on. Thanks very much indeed for coming on board the Sputnik. Coming up after the break is a woman who is emerging as the clearest thinker on Britain's chronic housing crisis, about which everybody talks and absolutely nobody does. I'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Hardly a day passes without a recognition of Britain's housing crisis. Virtually no social housing is built, prices and rents move ever upwards, as does the rate of homelessness, overcrowding and slum landlordism. In the capital, this is leading to the shipping out, like refugees, of homegrown Londoners to points north in order that someone somewhere can find them a roof to put over their heads. Britain is full up, say the Cassandras, about Calais, when in fact Britain is practically empty, as anyone who's ever flown over it knows. Just 2% of Britain's landmass is built upon. Unmet need, unused economic resources ought to have led to a building boom, but it has not. To find out why, I've invited the brightest of the young housing economists from the University of Leeds, Dr. Mary Robertson, and she joins me now. Dr. Robertson, thank you very much for coming on the Sputnik. Describe for the viewers the extent of this housing crisis.
Well, I think we can see currently many manifestations of the crisis. As you said, rising homelessness, rising rents, rising prices. people from London being shipped out because we just don't have enough social accommodation. So across the whole stretch of the housing system, we're getting signs that the system is just falling apart, basically. And this is a crisis that has been accumulating for over 30 years now. I think it dates back to the 1980s when the right to buy was introduced by Margaret Thatcher. Up until then, we'd had a system in which some people owned their own home, some people rented social accommodation. And so we had two sources of supply which catered to those who were able to access housing through the market and those who weren't. Now, the right to buy privatised the social housing stock on a massive scale and also prevented councils from building. And ever since then, we just haven't built enough houses to house our population, which is growing at quite a rapid rate. And in particular, we haven't built any houses, or nearly enough houses, to house people for whom accessing housing through the market is not possible because their incomes aren't high enough.
Even within capitalist logic, that doesn't make any sense, does it? You've got potentially a large number of people, many, many millions, who would like to secure a home. You've got unused building workers, supplies, materials, bricks could be quickly made, steel, electricity wire, and so on. What is stopping those two things from coming together?
So I think it depends on the point of view of which capitalist you're talking about. There are many harmful effects on the economy from the lack of housing that we've got at the moment. Rising housing costs puts pressure on wages. We have huge geographic variability in the country, so it's much harder. Most employment is in the southeast and London, but it's much harder to access housing there, which means for employers it's harder to access labour force and so on. And of course, we've had very low growth since the financial crisis, and a big programme of house building really helped to boost the economy.
Yeah, it would be a multiplier,
It would be a multiplier, exactly. The problem is there are some groups of people who benefit from the way that the housing system is organised currently. So in particular, mortgage lenders who have been able to reap great profits from lending ever higher mortgages. They get the interest payments as profit, but we've also seen, which culminated in the financial crisis, processes of securitisation, whereby the financial sector has turned mortgages into tradable financial assets and traded them at huge profits. So for parts of the financial sector, the system currently works very well. And of course, it works very well for landowners. Britain has one of the highest, most concentrated structures of land ownership in the world.
Wouldn't many of these landowners profit from more house building? What I'm getting at is if only 2% of the country is built upon, 98% of it is unbuilt upon, there's a lot of people need houses. Why don't we use some of that land to build houses?
It's because housing and indeed land has come to be treated like an asset, which means that the owners want its value to increase as much as possible. And that has been happening in Britain because supply has not matched up to demand. So you've got growing demand, supply not living up to it, which has driven up prices, which means that homeowners and landowners have seen the value of their land or housing assets increase. So it's been a huge boom in wealth for those who own these types of assets. But the flip side has been that more and more people find it difficult to access
you know, trees
housing.
don't vote, but people do. You would think that the political class would feel the pressure. It's kind of obvious, generation rent, people's children, even in their 40s, can't buy property. There's even men, no doubt women, in their 30s living in their parents' houses when once they would have been gone when they were 18 or 19 and so on. It's changing the whole social mix in the country.
That's true, and I think there are signs that the political pressures around housing are starting to shift in the right direction. But for decades, so under Thatcher right through to Blair, we were sold the idea that everyone should be a homeowner and have this asset, and people were encouraged to tie up their wealth in their housing. And this means that I think for a long time politicians have been terrified of taking measures that would lead house prices to fall, because you have a big constituency, which tend to be quite affluent voters anyway, who would be furious if the value of their property suddenly dropped. You know, that would be their pension, their inheritance for their kids, their savings, and a serious effort to make housing more affordable in general would imply falling house prices, and it would, you know.
But, you know, most of our viewers, I'm guessing, are city people. We keep hearing about the green belt, the inviolability of the green belt. How much green belt do we actually need? If 98% of the country is not built upon, that's a lot of green belt. Shouldn't we be building more towns, more cities?
There's definitely a case to be made for that, I think, yeah. The problem is where demand is. How do you make sure that the new supply matches to where the demand is, which reflects, of course, the economic organisation of the country, and it's very heavily weighted towards the southeast. So there is much more. House prices are much cheaper in the north of England, but part of the problem is that people don't want to live there because they can't find the same employment opportunities. Yeah. So the challenge is, how do we build more houses? Well, there's two challenges, and they're both quite enormous. One is, can we restructure the British economy so that it's no longer so heavily focused on the southeast, which would take pressure of the housing system there? And the other one is, can we figure out ways to build more housing in the southeast? But people, I think, accepting that we need to live in higher density forms is something that, in the age of global warming, people need to accept, for example.
Let me just raise another important issue then that I know you've got some expertise in. David Cameron, the catastrophe of the sale of council houses was seen by politically active people like myself at the time that it happened. We predicted absolutely everything that has happened, and as you've just described. But now David Cameron wants a second wave. He wants privatisation of other than council houses, other forms of social housing, housing association, right to buy. That's going to add disaster on top of disaster, surely.
Absolutely. I think it's a completely disastrous policy.
Is he serious about that? Is he going to go ahead with it?
So there's an interesting question about this, because this was something that the Tories pulled out in the lead into the general election, quite last minute, and people have speculated that they weren't expecting to win the election. They knew that in the 1980s the right to buy had been extremely popular, so it was an electoral ploy, basically, that they kind of hoped that, because they didn't expect to get an absolute majority, they hoped that they wouldn't have to fulfil. And now, much to everyone's surprise, they do have an absolute majority, and so it is going through. But criticisms are coming from across the political spectrum and across different types of agents involved in the housing system as well.
Do you expect the same demand to buy from tenants of housing associations?
I don't think there's any reason not to expect that, because for the individual household,
it's a no-brainer.
It's a huge bright, exactly. Yeah. You're offered a house for cheap, so you'd be mad to turn it down. The problem is that people housed in housing associations currently are, relatively speaking, for the kind of people who demand social housing, well housed. You know, these are the people we shouldn't be worrying about because they have decent long-term accommodation.
Better than council housing used to be, by and large.
It can be, yeah. In the meantime, we have 100,000 people in temporary housing because there just aren't enough housing association or council homes to house them in. So it's directing huge amounts of money, and the estimates range between 5.8 billion and 20 billion to help people whose housing needs are relatively well dealt with compared to other groups.
That brings me to my last point then. One of the things that I've been looking at is the scale of the money the taxpayer is handing to private landlords in terms of housing benefit. It's now capped, but capped at quite a high level. I mean, it's a phenomenal sum that the taxpayer is giving to private landlords, as compared with the tiny sum that the taxpayer is paying to build new social housing. How have they gotten away with this? It's a kind of grand larceny of the public purse, this.
It's a policy that makes no sense whatsoever. I think it's 24 billion, the housing benefit bill now.
25 billion.
25 billion. Yeah. And it's notable that 40% of that goes to private landlords. And of the properties originally sold on the right to buy, a lot of those have moved into the private sector. So the landlords who own these formal council properties are getting a threefold subsidy from the original building of the house, from the discount sale, and now in the rental income that they receive. So this idea that the right to buy has helped people realise a dream of home ownership is often not the case. It's just transferred state property or state subsidised properties into private individuals. How has this been allowed to happen? I think the tone was set in the 1980s, and thus far it hasn't really been challenged, that the state is allowed to intervene on the demand side, but it should not provide goods and services itself. So the supply side has been sidelined very heavily, and that's reflected in privatisation across the board, this idea that the state is inefficient and it should not be providing these kind of services.
Just briefly, a Jeremy Corbyn leadership, a new look for Labour, new policies, one presume, is a return to social housing as a desirable norm for many millions of people likely to happen?
Jeremy Corbyn has an excellent housing manifesto, and that the key point in that, I think, is allowing councils to borrow in order to invest in new housing. So he's signed up to doing that, and I think it could make, as in the 1930s when councils started building on a grand scale and gave good housing to people who had been living in slum conditions. It's possible, definitely.
Another reason to be cheerful about
Indeed.
Jeremy Corbyn. Thanks very much, Dr. Mary Robertson. Alas, that's all we've got time for on board the Sputnik this week. By the time you join me next week, it'll be a new political era, at least in Britain. Until then, it's been marvellous.